Hello, everyone, and welcome to the New Jersey Counseling Association monthly webinar held in collaboration with the Creativity and Counseling Division. My name is Whitney Hendrickson, and I'm one of the members of the NJCA Education and Training Committee. Today's webinar is titled Gottman's Couple and Counseling. Our presenter is Joel Levine. A little bit about Joel. He is a member of the Motivational Interviewing Network of Trainers, MINT or MINT, which combines training experience with clinical practice to enhance the motivational interviewing model internationally. He has recently completed all 3 levels of the Gottman Training. Joel is an experienced mental health educator and clinician with a master's in social work at Fordham University, specializing in substance use disorders. He has studied with William Miller, PhD, and Teresa Moyers, PhD, at the University of New Mexico as part of a study implementing motivational interviewing techniques. Mr. Levine is a licensed clinical social worker, licensed alcohol and drug counselor, licensed professional counselor, licensed marriage and family therapist, a clinical alcohol and drug counselor, and is certified by AAMFT, NASW, NBCC, and APCB-NJ as an approved supervisor.
That's a mouthful.
As a reminder, before we begin, in order to receive 1 CE, you must complete the evaluation, which will be provided to you at the end of this webinar. And I will be monitoring the chat throughout if there are any questions, and we have some time at the end to answer them. Thank you so much, and I will hand it over to Joel.
Great. So it's so good to see everybody. So today is about the Gottmans. It's not about motivational interviewing. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story. And then the hope here is that it's going to be a conversation or collaboration. Whitney knows that's what I always like, is I always like people to kind of share in the dialogue versus just disseminating information. But I, had been first licensed as a clinical social worker and a professional counselor, but I believed in family systems. And so I was introduced to Monica McGoldrick at the time, and I studied with her at her institute, as well as another institute down in Princeton that was called the Center for Family and Community and Social Justice. And so I was hooked. I was kind of hooked, in terms of family systems. So I became an LMFT, licensed marriage and family therapist, from that 5 years of family therapy training in 2005. And the reason that I'm saying this is because I was practicing marriage counseling or marriage therapy, and I had no map. And I don't know if anybody has experienced this, but I would certainly encourage you to kind of participate in the conversation that when you have no map, you have no way of knowing if what you're doing is working, right? You're just kind of feeling your way in the dark. And so, for 10 years, I was like, I need a map, right? That's basically what I was saying. And I had the honor and privilege of being introduced to John and Julie Gottman because they were actually teaching level 1 and level 2 in New York City. And it was basically the last time that they were actually doing level 1 and level 2. And so if you know about the Gottman certification, you have to take 3 levels. It's level 1, level 2, and level 3. And you have to take 2 additional modules, which is couple and addiction counseling or recovery, couple and addiction recovery, I think it is. And you also have to be able to take treating trauma and affairs. And then you have to be hooked up with a mentor, and then you are taping your sessions and demonstrating that you're meeting the benchmarks. So, it had been, basically, 5 or 6 years of studying with, the Gottman therapy, in order to become certified. And I was certified last year as, certified Gottman therapist. And the way that I did that is that I continued in this relationship with the mentor who's from the Gottman Institute, whose name is Dr. Robert Navarra. And he was the person who was evaluating my tapes to be able to see whether it could even go before the committee, the taping committee, to see if they met the benchmarks. But he would have to give his approval first. And after getting certified, I continue to meet with him twice a month because I value supervision and I value, getting feedback, right? There's the map again. So I am certified as a Gottman therapist, and what we're going to talk about today is the Gottman theory. And what I love about the theory is that John Gottman, Dr. John Gottman, he's a researcher. He's a mathematician, and he studied with Dr. Bob Levinson, where he wanted to be able to find out why relationships fail. That was his interest. He was not interested in helping people. He was only interested in finding out why marriages fail. And then he met Julie Gottman, Dr. Julie Gottman, and she said to him, "Why don't we use this research and try to help people with it?" Because she's a psychologist. And, he had no interest in helping people. But the two of them got together, and what they did is that they created the Gottman Institute. And the Gottman Institute is wonderful. They have many different things that they do, many products that they sell, and they have many workshops that they run, including they have three workshops, which is one is from Bringing Baby Home. Is anybody familiar with Bringing Baby Home? It's basically, this idea that when couples get married and they have children, the relationship satisfaction declines. So they have, a training for that. They have a training for, married couples, and they have recently a new one that is for singles or couples who are looking to get married. And then they also have the Art and Science of Love workshop. And so there's many different things that you can do, with the Gottman theory without even being certified. You can actually run workshops. And so, basically the Gottman Institute was started. It was started in, the 1980s. So it's been around, for 40 years. And the way they started is that they created what was called the Love Lab. Has anybody heard of the Love Lab? So, yeah, thank you, Denise. So the Love Lab, was an apartment-like setting on the grounds of the University of Seattle, Washington. And what they would do is they would invite couples over into the apartment and invite them to do things that couples normally do, couples to hang out. And it was a very nice setting, but they did everything that was scientific. So the couples wore Holter monitors. They were recorded, with, videos that cameras that were coming out of the wall. Because, again, this is the 1980s. It's not like today. And, they were, given all kinds of tests. Like, so one was called the gigolomometer, which I always love. It would see how much they would jiggle in their chair, right? But they were looking for conflict conversations. And what they realized is that there's something that is called emotional deposits. There's something that's called your emotional bank account. Has anybody heard of your emotional bank account? It's good. So in essence, what you need to be able to know is that the gold standard for a conflict conversation is you need to have 5 emotional deposits for every withdrawal. And conflict conversations are, again, it's so nice to be able to know that you don't need to be able to eliminate conflict from your conversations, right? It's not about getting rid of conflict, it's learning how to be able to manage it, and learning how to manage it in a way where your physiology, right? You stay out of what's called DPA, or diffuse physiological arousal. You're in the front part of your brain, right? You're not in fight or flight, so that's the concept of flooding. So that's a little bit about the background. And what they created is they created a model. So the Gottman Institute, Dr. John and Julie Gottman, they created a model that's called the Sound Relationship House. Has everybody heard of the Sound Relationship House? Right. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about the Sound Relationship House. And what I also said we would do today is we would talk about what's called a conflict blueprint. Because again, this idea about managing conflict. And I always kind of like associate this with cars like from the 50s and the 60s, right? I don't because I was an EMT for years. So I love this description that, in cars in the 1950s and 60s, I don't know if anybody has seen any of those cars, but they're like tanks, right? They're like solid. And what would happen is that the car would get in an accident and there would be no dents on the car, but the people inside would have died, right? And so, what we've realized is that through time, right, you need to be able to have a car that absorbs the energy, right? So that the car can have dents on it, but inside the car, everybody's fine. And so here, the idea is learning how to be able to manage conflict well. So again, it's not about eliminating it, it's about managing it well. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about is how do you do that, right? And there's something that is called the conflict blueprint. So what I'd be interested in, I know most of you have your cameras off, but I'm thanking Denise, but I'm wondering what has been your exposure to Gottman therapy, so I just can kind of know where you're at. Seems like Denise, you have a lot. Anybody want to share in terms of what their exposure has been? First time. Okay, great. And very minimal. Okay, great. Yeah.
A little. I've looked into it. So because I am kind of curious about it, and
Yeah.
so that's why the terms that you're putting out, I have heard them because I looked into it. It doesn't mean I know a lot about it.
Yeah.
It just means I've heard it.
You're
That's
just,
all.
just enough knowledge to be dangerous, huh?
Exactly.
Well, and I share my personal story. Yes, most people haven't had any. So, what I wanted is I wanted to be able, I mentioned a map, having a map, but what I wanted to be able to do is I wanted to be able to work in a way that was based upon research. Yeah, so heard in interviews very little. So what I understood, right, from the Gottmans is that they want, basically they were saying at the time, and this was in the first Marriage Minute, right? So, there's a book called the Marriage Minute. But what they discovered in the time is that most of the therapies were not evidence-based therapies, right? So they weren't based upon research. And what they discovered is that by going to a counselor, couples would actually get worse. And they actually looked at all of the couples therapy at the time. There's a whole history of that. And what they discovered is that their aim was to be able to move what was called five standard deviations. So if you know what a standard deviation is, it's a research term. And basically what they're saying is that they want the couple to be able to come to a couples counselor and to be able to move from being miserable to, instead of being slightly less miserable, right, to be able to have an amazing relationship. So that's the idea is that the mathematics is that if you think of what five standard deviations, that's pretty significant, right? It's pretty significant, and that's the goal, right? And so that's kind of what I wanted, is I wanted to be able to know that what I was doing was based upon research. And like I said, they have many, many books, but they do have three books for people who are lay people, right? They have one that's called Fight Right, which is, helping people to understand again about managing conflict. They also have one, that is called Seven Principles for Making Marriages Work. And then they also have another that's called Eight Dates, and those are for lay people. And then they have many that are written that are for clinicians. And so, this is, what I understand is that it's based upon research. So we're able to duplicate it, we're able to replicate it. Okay. Any questions so far? Okay. Okay, so if there's no questions, so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the sound relationship house. And so I have a diagram here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen, and you'll be able to see my screen. And it's saying, Whitney, I need your help. It's saying you've disabled
All
participant
right,
screen.
you're all set. Sorry about that.
Okay, I've been forbidden. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Um, hmm, applications. It's really okay. Okay. So share my screen, like not allowing me to do stuff here. Give me 1 second. So the sound relationship house, or the sound relationship house theory, is this idea that it is on, doing, um, it's doing something. Okay, so everybody can see my screen. So this is what it is, right? Um, so the idea is that when you look at the sound relationship house, this is their theory, right? And it's based upon research. Like I said, it's more than 3,000 couples. I think at this point it's 4,000 couples, because it's the foundation of the Gottman method. And basically, like it says here, the goal is to achieve greater understanding, connection, and intimacy. So if you look at this screen, what it basically says is, it says that in order to have a solid house, you need to be able to have two different things. You need to be able to first have what's called load-bearing walls, and then you need to be able to have these different systems that work together. So one of the systems is what's called the friendship system. Another one is what's called the conflict management system. And another one is called the shared meaning system. So what they do is that they are able to define what are load-bearing walls. And so the idea is that it's about trust and commitment. So trust, as you can see here, is that trust is about having your partner's back, right? It's asking the question, will you be there for me? When you trust your partner, you're able to know that your partner has your back, right? And you need to be able to know that your partner is going to keep you physically, mentally, and emotionally safe. And when you are committed, right, what it means is, it means that it's a lifelong journey. It means that you're in this relationship and there's nowhere else that you'd rather be, right? You're saying that for commitment, you want to be able to know that your partner is not comparing you to a real or fantasized other, right? So that's what trust and commitment is. And it describes here, 5 ways to build trust, level, love, and loyalty in your relationship. Is that trust needs to be a priority, and you need to be able to act in a way that maximizes the benefits, not just for yourself, but also for your partner. And it's about these, what's called small things often. The Gottmans talk about small things often. And that's this idea about being consistent in the relationship. So when you are demonstrating commitment, you are, again, not you are not trashing your partner, you're cherishing your partner. You're not comparing your partner to somebody else. So if it's small things often, it's that you are able to act in a way that cherishes your partner's positive qualities. You're not trying to change the person, and you're not focusing on the things that they're doing wrong. You're focusing on the things that they're doing well. Okay, so if I come back to you, which would be nice. How do I come back to you? Okay. Okay. How do I come back to you? So hopefully I haven't lost you.
If you click on stop share, that should bring you back to us.
That would be great. All right. It's at the very bottom. That's why. Okay. Um, I lost my stop share. So does that make sense that in order to have a solid house, you need to have two load-bearing walls? And it's important to know what both trust and commitment are in terms of your house. Does that make sense to you? Okay. So, like I said, so it's about load-bearing walls, and then it is about what is called these different systems. So like I said, there's three systems. And the first system is what's called your friendship system. So what I was saying to you is your friendship system is comprised of three things, right? And I can share the screen again, but it is comprised, and again, I'm not reading off of anything. That's why I don't have a PowerPoint because it's in here. Because what I believe is I believe that you need to not only memorize it, but also to be able to relate it, right? So let's just take an opportunity before doing that. Yeah, so I'm happy to give you access. Sure. Yeah, that's no problem. And the recording is made available. Um, so who here is in a relationship? Doesn't have to be an intimate relationship, but you're in a relationship and you feel like you can trust the person to have your best interest at heart or have your back, and that you feel like that they are committed to you, that they're not comparing you to somebody else that's either real or fantasized. Yeah. And that feels pretty good, right? It feels pretty good to be in a relationship where trust and commitment are the foundations of your relationship, right? So that's a good starting point. So what the three components of what is called the friendship system. Again, these are three necessary systems. So, like I said, I was trained in family systems. So, family systems means, and understand this, right? Understand this idea that a system, I don't know if you've ever heard of the term non-summativity. Has anybody heard of that term? It, but you have all heard of it, even though you're shaking your head no. Who here has heard the term that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts? Has anybody heard that? That's non-summativity, right? So you have heard that term. And so what it means is it means you can't drill this down to any single component and to be able to say, if we have all these components, we have a great house or we have a great relationship. It's saying that a system is designed to be able to work with other systems, right? So again, when I learned family systems 25 years ago, Monica McGoldrick talked about how the idea is you can't learn systems by memorizing, you have to learn systems by living it. It's a way of thinking, it's a way of relating. And so what I'm hoping is that I'm hoping that you're taking the information in today and you're relating it to your relationships, because you can take a free marriage checkup, right? It's online and you can kind of see where you're at. What we use is we use what's called the relationship checkup in doing therapy, because what we do is the first four sessions, and this is a very important concept to understand. So, in anybody here who's working with other people, do you have a solid assessment before you begin treatment? Who here engages a client in a solid assessment before beginning treatment? It's an important question. And the reason the question is there is because as a clinician, would fall into this trap. Before I knew the Gottmans, people would come into my office, and I'm hoping this kind of sounds familiar to you. Our life is falling apart. You need to do something. We're, like one step away from, going to divorce court, or, like, I just don't know if I can get through the next day. And there's all this pressure, right, that they give you to be able to say, I need you to help us, fix us, fix this, do that, right? And that's a trap. So what we know is that it's really important to be able to do a solid assessment. It's actually, in my opinion, Joel's opinion, but the Gottmans talk about this, is that it's actually unethical to begin treatment without doing a solid assessment. And so with the Gottmans, you actually do four sessions before you begin treatment. So as a Gottman therapist, so you meet with the couple together, right? And you're asking what brings them there, right? Because it's always important, that's one of the first questions I learned in doing therapy is what brings you here today? I understand that you've been depressed your whole life, but what brings you here today, right? So that's an important question. You need to be able to know when people are coming to you is what brings them to you now, right? And then we take them through a history of their relationship. Why do you think we do that as a Gottman therapist? Why do you think we take people through a history of their relationship? It's called an oral history. Why do you think you do that? There's a very specific reason to explore the foundation. Well, it's partly that, Eileen, but it's a little bit different because what we want them to know, what we want to know, not we want them to know, what we want to know is can they remember the things they like about their partner, right? Can they remember positive events? Because if they cannot remember the good things that happened in the first years of their relationship, their dating, how they got together, what attracted them to each other, right? If they can't remember that, then their relationship is in a detrimental place. And I had a couple I was working with recently. One of the first questions that we ask in the oral history is we say, what attracted you to the other person? What stood out for you? Tell me about your first meeting, right? What were your first impressions? That's what we ask, right? That's one of the first questions that we ask. And the woman said, he was hot, right? He was tall, he was handsome, and he was hot. And what do you think he said, right? You would think he would say, like, thanks, like, wow, that's really nice that you thought that of me, right? Well, what he said instead was he said, that's pretty shallow. And my eyebrows went up and I was like, yeah, this is not going to go well, right? So yeah, she says it's one of my favorite assessment, yeah, questions. So I mean, so you want to be able to know if they're in a positive sentiment place, right? If they're in a negative sentiment. If they cannot remember the good things about the relationship, you know that they're not in a good place. So what I was saying is that the first session is a session together, right? We do three things. We first ask them what brings them here now. We take them through the oral history in terms of these questions. And then what we do is we have them do what's called a conflict discussion. We want to be a fly on the wall where we are observing them, right? Because remember, we know that managing conflict, I said you need to be able to have five positive things to every negative, right? So it's like going to the bank, right? I've had some pretty yeah. So Dr. Reddy said, funny when you said that. Um, the woman said, yeah, yeah, that was pretty shallow. Yeah. Just like, this is not going well. This is not a good sign. I was like, uh-oh. Um, but again, in assessment, all you're doing is collecting information. Your job is to kind of keep your poker face. You're not trying to give them feedback at that point. So all you're trying to do is collect information. But what I was saying is in the first session, we also do a conflict discussion where we want to be able to see how they manage conflict, right? So, for 10 minutes, we want to observe them having a conversation, about something that's coming up for them lately or a conflict they've had lately, right? Because we want to be able to do that because that helps us to understand how do they manage conflict. So that's the first session. In the second and third session, we meet with each of them individually. Because like I said, that family systems training I had in the first 5 years where I learned genograms and I learned about family of origin or FOO, right? That is really important because we want to be able to know what their growing up experience was or what stood out for them about their growing up experience because that's their blueprint or that's their map, right? In terms of like how they learn how to manage conflict. I can tell you in my growing up experience, my parents did not manage conflict well, right? They basically, didn't talk about things, right? And this is why I like talking about conflict because conflict is really important to a relationship. Conflict is an opportunity for intimacy. It's an opportunity to learn about yourself and to learn about your partner, right? And I'd much rather have a couple that comes to me that's fighting and in distress than a couple who is not fighting. What do you think about that statement? Would you rather have somebody come to you where everything seems fine on the surface, or that they are really intense? Which one would you rather have? Not fighting is avoiding. Yeah. You're basically turning away from your partner. Yeah. If they're not fighting, they're checked out. Exactly. Yes, that's exactly right. They're checked out. So I'd much rather have a couple who is intense because I know that they still have skin in the game. I know that they still are invested in the other person. So that's really a good thing. So then the fourth session is they've completed what's called the relationship checkup, which is what I said is it's an online assessment that's standardized instruments. And then so in the feedback session, we give them that report and we talk about, the feedback about those first four sessions. And then what we do is we create a treatment plan. And the treatment plan is, again, the map about where we're going, right? So that's important. So coming back to our sound relationship house, I was saying that the first system is what's called the friendship system. So I'm going to share my screen again, but first, do you have any questions about what I'm describing? I mean, I get excited about this because, like, it works, right? So it's based on research, but it also makes sense to me, right? You can't have a relationship unless you trust your partner and you have your partner looking at you versus looking at somebody else. And you can't have a relationship unless there's friendship in the relationship and managing conflict well and being able to have shared purpose and meaning. Those are the essential ingredients for a relationship. So it makes sense to me. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen again. All right. So like I was saying, so if you look at the screen here, it says build love maps, share fondness and admiration, and turn towards instead of away. So these three things are what's considered your friendship system. So love maps means that you know your partner and you feel known by your partner. It means that you have a roadmap inside of you that knows your partner's thoughts and feelings and hopes and dreams and values and goals and aspirations, right? So, seven things. I'm not asking you to know all those things, but you are able to, just like when you were first dating or first in a relationship, you would ask each other all kinds of open-ended questions. You would ask, like, what's your favorite color? What's your favorite food? And what we know is that over time, those love maps need to be updated. You need to be able to continue to ask each other open-ended questions and be able to know the answers, right? And they have, which again is so amazing, right? Because what they have is they have what's called a card deck, right? So a card deck is what is called, right? It looks like this. It's a deck of cards, but there's something that you can do online where you can download it, right? And you can do this with your partner, where you can have an exercise to be able to ask your partner those open-ended questions and to remember the answers, right? So you don't even have to come up with the questions. They even give you the questions, right? So the idea is that you want to be able to know your partner and feel known by your partner. That is one of the most basic parts of friendship. And then the next piece of this is what's called shared fondness and admiration. And somebody said this in the chat earlier. What they said is that you need to be able to point out the good things that your partner does. One of my favorite jokes, because John Gottman gives lots of jokes, one of my favorite jokes that he's given is he says there was a couple that was married and he loved his wife so much that he almost told her, right? That's one of my favorite jokes. Because that's the idea is you have to point out the good things that your partner does. You have to be able to maximize the positive things and minimize the negatives, right? So you need to be able to create what's called a culture of appreciation respect. So it's both verbally and non-verbally that you're sharing affection, admiration, right? Appreciation and respect. Those are four things that are necessary. And again, I'm not asking you to remember all these things. This is up here, right? But I call it like being a AAA encourager, right? Appreciation, admiration, affection. If you think about being a AAA encourager, right, that's the idea here about sharing fondness and admiration. It's almost like if you took a house and you took a room in your house and you wrote down everything you loved about your partner And then you took another room in your house and you wrote down everything you can't stand about your partner. If you stay in that room, you will never go back to the first room, right? So you need to be able to point out the good things that your partner does. So this is this idea about sharing fondness and admiration. You have to be able to point out the good things that your partner does. And it tells you right here, right, is that this is where I was mentioning about going to the bank, right? So what they talk about, what did I say that the minimum number of deposits is needed for a conflict discussion? Do you remember the number? Five, right? So it's 5 to 1, right? So the idea is that if you're not going to the bank and making emotional deposits, you're going to be in negative sentiment override, which is going to be right here, right? It means that you're going to be bouncing checks. It means you're going to be collecting a whole lot of fees, right? And I don't know if anybody's been in a relationship with a bank where they've collected fees. They've been in overdraft fees, right? And then, like insufficient fund fees, and then, monthly maintenance fees. And then the bank is making all this kind of money on you, and you're not making any money. You're paying them the interest. They're not paying you interest, right? So the idea is that that's part of this, is that you need to have good friendship, which is building love maps, right? Knowing each other, knowing each other's inner world. It's your inside world, right? That you're maintaining awareness of your partner's world. And then you're making these emotional deposits into this emotional bank account. And there's two ways to get paid, which is so funny about this, right? So you can actually get paid once, or you can get paid twice. So I don't know if anybody likes residual income, but I certainly do, right? So the idea is that the way to be able to get paid once is your partner asks you for something. Can we get pizza tonight? And you say yes, and you get pizza. That's getting paid once. But you can get paid twice on the same deposit. And the way to do that is to be able to anticipate your partner's needs and to be able to meet your partner's needs without being asked. So, has anybody had that experience where their partner's like, if you would just know how to make my coffee in the morning, right? Or if you would just do this, right? Just pick up your shoes from the living room, right? So the idea is that you can get paid twice on the same deposit. And when you do that, your emotional bank account grows. And then the next piece of friendship is what's called turning towards instead of turning away. And so what the Gottmans discovered, right, is that there are bids for connection, right? And that's an important word to know. So there's bids for connection, which is anything that your partner does that signals for emotional connection and attention, right? So I always give the example like if you're, down by a lake and your partner says, like, hey, that's a nice sailboat. And you say, yeah, that's a nice sailboat. That is your partner signaling for attention, like the ball goes over the net and you return the serve. And what they say is by the research is that you need to be able to be a master of a relationship, you need to be able to have like 80% of meeting your partner's bids, right? So it's this idea of turning towards your partner 80% of the time. They said disasters of relationship. I don't think anybody wants to be a disaster, but to be a disaster in a relationship, you only turn toward your partner like 30% of the time. So the idea is that you don't have to get all of your partner's bids or signals for connection, but you need to be able to get at least 2/3 of them, right? You need to be able to turn towards your partner as opposed to turning away, which is ignoring your partner, or turning against your partner, which is saying things like, that's a stupid sailboat. Why are you even looking at that? Right? That would be turning against. Or turning away would be like totally ignoring your partner. So this idea is accepting bids for emotional connection. These three things here, building love maps, sharing fondness and admiration, turning towards instead of away, those are the three things that are needed for solid friendship in your relationship. So if you're doing that, you are in a positive place in your relationship. You're in a positive perspective. That means that you are remembering the good things that your partner's doing. I refer to this kind of like as a slide rule. And I know that's an old term, but if you have a number line where 0 is in the middle, and then the negative integers are to the left and the positive integers are to the right. Does anybody remember a number line from school? Yep. So it's nice to think of it as a number line because sometimes, depending upon the mood and the day you're in, you may be slipping into a negative place, but you can be intentional and move yourself out of that. But if you're in a negative place in your relationship, you're anticipating criticism. You're not thinking your partner's having a bad day and giving them grace. You are assuming that they are mad at you, right? And you're assuming that they are thinking that you are, just not a good person to be with, right? You're taking it very personally. So it means that when you ask that first question about, tell me about the good things in your relationship, and they can't remember any, or you say, like, you remember that great trip that we took, to see the Potomac River where the Love Lab is on the grounds of the University of Seattle, Washington? They're like, what great trip? That was a waste of time, right? So if they're turning against you, right, that means if they can't remember positive things, or they either turn positive things into negative things or neutral things, meaning that they're just, just blasé about it, then it means you're in a negative sentiment override or you're in a negative place in your relationship. And this is a funny thing about the Gottman method is that they say that this is the only area of the sound relationship house that they don't have a tool for. Everything else, there's a tool. But this is the only area where there's no tool. And the reason is because this is where you have to intentionally be nice to your partner even when you don't want to be. So I always find that very funny. So questions so far. So you have your load-bearing walls, you have your solid friendship, and you're now in a positive perspective. So now we come to conflict, right? And I was saying that conflict is kind of one of the highlights of this. And what they say is that you have to be able to do 6 things well in order to have the ability to manage conflict. So number one, you need to be able to know that the way you start a conversation is going to determine how it's going to go. So if you start with a you statement, chances are you're talking about the other person. You're not talking about yourself. So you need to be able to use what's called a gentle startup. That's a Gottman term, but it means that you talk about your own feelings. It talks about what you need. It's called expressing a positive need. So you need to be able to use a gentle startup. And this is my pet peeve, right? I know my biases, and this is my pet peeve. So my pet peeve is where people say, I feel like, or I feel that. Who here has done that? When you say, you're feeling, and then you say, I feel like, or I feel that, right? That's not a feeling, right? I love, yeah, I statements. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Eileen. Because you could say, I feel that you're a jerk, right? That's not a feeling, right? That's describing the other person, right? Yeah. So when people say, it says in the chat, it's when people say a feeling, they really mean opinion. Yeah, it's an excuse to blame the other person, right? So you need to be able to talk about what your feelings are, right? So, and this is my job, right? My job as a Gottman therapist is to be what's called therapeutically rude, right? That's my job. My job is to be able to say, you're communicating in a way that is not helpful. And the research says there's a better way of communicating. So let me stop you and let's try this instead, right? So being therapeutically rude is my specialty. So, so the first thing is using a gentle startup. So the next thing is staying out of the four horsemen. So one of the things that we do is we give people guides, right? So part of people coming to me for couples therapy is at the end of the session, I do 2 things. Number one, I send them the link to the relationship checkup, right? They need to have that kind of like at the first session. And then the next thing I do is I also send them PDFs or relationship guides. And so there's 6 guides. It looks like this, right? And one of them is what's called the Four Horsemen. So the Four Horsemen, it's a biblical term, right? Just like in Revelations, it's the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. And so the Four Horsemen, it's really nice to be able to know this because for every one, there's an antidote. So the first one is what's called criticism, where you're attacking the character of the other person, right? The antidote, instead of that, is to use what did I just say? The gentle startup, right? I statements. The next one is contempt, which is contempt is an air of superiority. Think about if you've ever done this in a relationship where you're being sarcastic, you're rolling your eyes, right? You're mocking them by, repeating what they're saying in an exaggerated way, or you're saying, oh, I would never do that, right? It's an air of superiority. And the Gottmans say that they know from the research that they can tell a relationship failure by 93%. With 93% accuracy, they can tell which relationship is going to fail based upon the presence of contempt. So the idea is that you need to stay out of contempt and instead to be able to create a culture of appreciation, respect, like I was saying before, and then the next one is defensiveness, right? So defensiveness is playing the victim. It's being a martyr. They call it self-protection through righteous indignation, right? So the idea is that when you are defensive, you're being like the victim, right? It's always my fault. I'm always the scapegoat in this relationship. Does that sound familiar? Right? So the opposite or the antidote to defensiveness is to take responsibility. And then the last one is what's called stonewalling. And so stonewalling is this idea that you are kind of throwing your hands up and saying, forget it. It's giving the person the silent treatment, right? So the four horsemen are very destructive to a relationship. So the next thing that you need to be able to do is what's called accept influence. So this is really nice because the idea is you don't have to agree with your partner, right? You can disagree with them. You can think that they're full of hot air, but you still need to be able to find a way to take in their perspective and to be able to say, good point. So that's the survey, I think. Oh, and something like that in the chat. So, the idea is you don't have to agree with your partner, but you have to find a way to be able to say, I can see where you're coming from. You're taking in their perspective as valid. The next thing that you need to be able to do is stay out of flooding. If you remember before, I said, if you're in the back part of your brain, if you're in the limbic system, you can't take in new information, right? Because your prefrontal cortex is offline, right? So you need to be able to stay calm and cool in a conversation, stay in your parasympathetic nervous system. You also need to be able to compromise or find middle ground. It doesn't mean you give up your position, but you're finding some way that the two of you can be in the middle. And then the next thing you have to do is to be able to repair. Repair is really nice because repair is something that happens naturally in a conversation. So it means that you're able to kind of smile at your partner, bat your eyes if you're a lady, right? You make a joke, right? You're able to touch your partner on the arm, right? You're able to prevent the conversation from escalating and getting off track, right? From really skyrocketing. So that's the things that you need to be able to do. So I'm going to just share the screen again, just so you can see it, right? And so this is the middle part of the house. This is called managing conflict. And what it's saying is, like I said, accepting influence from your partner. You're open to compromise. You're talking about yourself, not the other person. And this is really important. This is what's called the speaker listener exercise. And it's part of the conflict blueprint, because I mentioned that I was going to tell you about the conflict blueprint. So part of the conflict blueprint is you take turns being a speaker and a listener. So what that means is it means that you are able to, let me just come back to you. And what it means is that you are able to understand that the speaker has a job and the listener has a job. So the speaker's job is to be able to use I statements, stay out of the four horsemen, and express a positive need. And the listener's job is to be able to listen with the purpose of understanding, right? So the idea is that they're able to listen, right, without preparing their agenda about what they're going to say. They're really trying to take in and to be able to understand what are you saying. And they're doing that with two cornerstones. So number one is empathy in terms of what does it feel like to your partner? And number two is validation, which is simply that makes sense, right? And then they would ask the question, did I get that right? And then their partner would say, yeah, you understand me. And then they switch. So the speaker then becomes a listener. I give people a metaphor. So I'd like to give you this metaphor. It's this idea of having two tissue boxes. So if you have your tissue box and you're the speaker, that means your partner, who's the listener, is keeping their tissue box on the floor. It means they're holding your tissue box with you. So they're not talking about themselves. They're not saying they're sorry because people think that saying they're sorry is part of listening. It's not, right? We don't want people to say they're sorry. We want them to be able to communicate understanding. We want them to communicate back what they're hearing. So the listener is holding the tissue box with the speaker. And when they say, did they get that right? And the listener says, yes, the listener puts their tissue box on the floor and then the speaker then picks up, then the person who becomes the speaker then picks up their tissue box from the floor, and the other person puts theirs down, right? So the idea is only one of you has their tissue box at the time, and you're both holding that tissue box. Does that make sense? Okay, so I know we don't have a lot of time. Again, it's good information, and I don't expect you to memorize all of it, but it's to give you kind of a taste. It's to whet your appetite. So the next part of this is what's called a shared meaning system. So in any relationship, you need to have shared purpose and meaning, and you need to be able to do four things, right? So number one, you need to be able to have rituals of connection, which are things to look forward to, right? So things to look forward to are there's zillions of them, right? Birthdays, anniversaries, holidays, initiating and refusing lovemaking, having date nights, having what's called a State of the Union address where you're talking about the business of your household. It's about having a stress reducing conversation, talking about things that are stressful outside your relationship. It's about knowing what's going to happen in your partner's day without them leaving, and so you know at least what's going to happen in their day. It's about greeting each other. It's about having a 6-second kiss. It's about having reunions. There's zillions of ways to be able to have rituals of connection, but rituals of connection are anything that you do with your partner that you have to look forward to. And then the other three things, which are part of the shared meaning system, is having shared roles in terms of the hats that each of you wear, the goals or the things that you want in your relationship. And then it's also having shared symbols. Can anybody think of an example of a symbol in a relationship? Who here thinks about money? Who here likes to spend money, especially when it's not yours? Well, money is a symbol of a relationship, right? So if one person spends all the money and one person saves all the money, you're not aligned on symbols, right? On money. One person may want to be able to invite everybody over to their house and have a party house, and the other person wants to shut out the world and just have a safe refuge, right? So the idea is symbols in your relationship. Those are things that are part of the shared meaning system. So I'm going to just share the screen again, just so you can see it. So at the top of the house, you have what's called the shared meaning system. So to kind of review this, right? You want to be able to have a solid what? Friendship system, right? Which is comprised of which three things, right? Building love maps, sharing fondness and admiration, turning towards. You also want to be able to manage conflict well. And you also want to have shared meaning or purpose in your relationship, as well as the load bearing walls of trust and commitment. So, the next thing I want to share with you, I know we only have a few minutes, is what's called the conflict blueprint. Right? I said I can send this to you. But the idea is that this is what we just spoke about a minute ago. So it's taking turns being a speaker and a listener, right? So a speaker, right, talks about I statements, they talk about their feelings, they state a positive need, right? The Gottmans have an expression within every complaint is a longing, right? So tell your partner the things you want, not what you don't want. right? And it's no blaming, no you statements. So that's the speaker's job. Stay out of the four horsemen. The listener's job, postpone their agenda, just like I said. Hear what the speaker is saying in terms of their feelings, validate, right? And you can ask questions. And this is the other thing I was telling you about, which is if you're flooded, you want to be able to calm your body by breathing, doing progressive muscle relaxation. You're doing things to be able to calm yourself. So the Gottmans call this the rapport, right? The rapport is this idea of taking turns being a speaker and a listener. And then they have two other things because they have what's called dreams within conflict and compromise, which is called compromise ovals. And so what the reason that they have these exercises is because what they know is that 69% of couples problems are not solvable. So two-thirds of couples problems are perpetual. They come up again over and over again. And it's okay, like I said, in terms of conflict, to be able to have perpetual problems. But what they have discovered is that even though only a third of couples problems, 31% are solvable, even though the other 69% are perpetual, there's a small amount that are gridlocked. And they show up, and I'll share the screen one last time. They show up in the sound relationship house here where it's making life's dreams come true because they show up in this top part of the house because you don't feel supported in your life dreams, right? So when you are gridlocked, just like a gridlocked in New York City, you don't get anywhere, right? You either, say forget it, you kind of walk away, you sweep it under the rug. But that's the idea is that if you don't manage conflict well with gridlock, it's going to show up in this top part of the house. So that's the idea is to be able to have a structured exercise to help people to compromise. Because I said that when we manage conflict well, one of the objects of that is to be able to compromise. So that's what today has been about. It's an hour. But it's an idea to be able to first understand the sound relationship house, and it's also to be able to understand the conflict blueprint. And so what I'd leave you with today is again, there's an app to download. It's free. You go to your app store and it's called Gottman Card Decks, Gottman Card Decks. And it has these decks, just like I have the physical cards, right? That's like building rituals of connection. It's about love maps, right? It's about opportunity. There's my favorite, which is about sex. It's about salsa, right? Which is mild, medium, and spicy, which you can imagine would be very interesting. So it's Gottman, Gottman, card, Card, decks, Decks, like you power wash your deck. So it's free. You can download it. So that's what I leave you with today, Sound Relationship House and Conflict Blueprint. Questions, thoughts?